I want to look at some things as to exactly why and how people are so resistant in our world. And I hinted at this earlier, but what I want us to think about and to see is that in each era, in each people group, there are different points of resistance to the gospel. That's what I'm wanting us to see. We live in a particular tribe of people in the United States. And in our particular tribe, there are things in our world that people are more resistant to in that. Now, if you go to some other culture, some other tribe, some other group of people, it's going to be different. But because this is where we are, I want us to understand what is it that makes people resistant to the gospel in our world. Now, I want to preface it by saying, I know what makes people resistant. It's the fact that they are dead in their sins and that the God of this world has blinded their minds and all of that. That's the root answer to that. And I don't want to get away from that. But there are specific ways in each culture and among each people group that Satan works to blind people's minds to the gospel. When I've been in Honduras, there's a people group called the Garifuna, and what's blinding their minds is their voodoo. I mean, that's literally what they're engaged in there. That's a certain thing that's blinding their minds, that they see that as the answer to being able to control and to live within their world. But if I go somewhere else, it's going to be something completely different. But I want us to look at what in our world, in our culture, what does that means by which Satan often blinds the minds of people. So we look at the next slide. I want to think about the two-story structure of the modern mind. Now, I'm going to give you, and I can make it as brief as possible, but I'm going to give you a brief history lesson on this. So if we could look at this next slide and give you a brief history lesson using this as kind of an initial way of looking at it. Let me talk to you about a man named Immanuel Kant. Okay, late 18th century, early 19th century, Immanuel Kant. He wrote this book called Kritik der reinen Vernunft, or A Critique of Pure Reason. And if anybody suffer from insomnia, read this book, and it's a cure right there. I mean, it is a deadly book at that level. You will sleep if you try to read Kritik der reinen Vernunft. And so Immanuel Kant, though, wanted in some sense, as he sees this idea of Christianity not faring well from the intellectualism that's arising in what's known as the Enlightenment. So he sees that Christianity is being challenged at some level. And he wants, in some sense, to preserve Christianity. That's part of his goal in this. And so he separates the world into two different parts. Separates the world into two parts. He said there are things that are the phenomenal realm. Now, we use phenomenal to mean amazing and everything like that, but that's not how he meant it. He uses the word phenomenal to mean things that you can touch, taste, see, hear, feel, those type of things. All of the stuff, okay, is what he says is the phenomenal world in this. We could call those, as it develops throughout the 19th century, the facts. Now, that realm there was sort of the scientific realm right there. That was subject to the sciences. Now, he wanted to rescue Christianity from being judged by those standards. So he said, there's another realm. We'll call that the top story of the house of values, things that are subjective and private. That is to say, they're experiential. Things that don't necessarily that you may experience and feel, and it's no less real than the other things, but it's not really subject to inquiry on the basis of science. Now, as I said, he meant well in this, in so many ways. He wanted to save Christianity in his own mind from being subjected to being nothing more than being subjected to the laws and the rules of science. But what he does by that, and in many ways he's reflecting something that's going on in the world that develops into what's called romanticism. We're not going to get into that. But what he does in some sense in that is actually something that has shaped the world still today that was very detrimental. That is to say that people perceive that there's basically two levels to reality. There's a level that applies to all people, and that's that level that is a scientific level. That applies to everybody. So if you have a scientific study for something, then it must be true. And so the scientific aspect, that applies to all people. We could call that the public realm or the public sphere, okay? So we got that applies to everybody. But your religious faith, your belief in God, that is something that is a private value that's subjective, and that goes in kind of the top floor, the bedrooms, we might say, and you keep that to yourself. That keeps that to, and it doesn't have any place in public policy. It doesn't have any place in any of these other things. It's something that is private and subjective in that. That's the way people think in the world in which we live now, is thinking in these terms. If you try to bring your Christian faith into the public sphere, you might as well look at somebody and ask them, why don't we ride a unicorn to the moon or something like that. It just doesn't work. You keep that private. You keep that to yourself, while the things that are public are those things that are, the word would be empirically verifiable. That is, that you can test them scientifically, are the things that are public in the world. Now, this is really important for us when we look at apologetics, because this makes it tough in some sense. Because somebody will look at you and say, well, that may work for you, but it doesn't work for me. Now, when they say that, they may never have heard of Immanuel Kant, but they're living by this worldview, where you may feel that way, and that may be working for you. That's your private value, but I don't have to accept your private value as mine because I have different private values. And religion belongs in that category. We see that lived out so many ways in this. Now, what this has resulted in many ways, is that the focus of faith has moved from what I believe, the truth that I believe, to my personal experience of believing becomes the focus. Now, I know it's a little bit wordy right there, but I want to try to unpack that for you a little bit. What I mean by that is that in talking about faith, people often speak of not, this is true, the truth in which I believe, but they primarily focus on my personal experience of faith. You see that especially in the 19th century hymns, for example. And if I criticize this is your favorite hymn, then I'm sorry, but I'm just using it as an example right here. You ask me how I know he lives. He what? He lives within my heart. Well, in other words, the proof becomes not, did he really rise from the dead? Becomes not, is there evidence of that? Becomes not, is there eyewitness testimony to that? No, the proof that Jesus is alive is he lives within my heart. Well, that's all great and good for you, but you just lived completely on the top floor of that house. You said, I've got this personal experience, and my personal experience, it works for me. He lives within my heart. To which the person who you're talking to can very well and very validly say, well, that's fine for you. But Buddha lives in my heart, or whatever else I want to put there. That's the response to that. Because Christianity has been, at that point, privatized at that point. Now, the interesting thing is, as you look at your diagram of the house, is there were two responses in the 19th century primarily to this. One of them is what became known as revivalism. Revivalism. And that is, in revivalism, they tried to take that stuff on the top floor and bring it down to the bottom floor. Which is to say, everybody needs this experience of trusting in Jesus. And you have the revivalists of the 19th century like Finney and Charles Finney and people like that. And what they're doing is trying to say everybody needs those values that are on the top floor. Everybody needs those. So let's bring them down and make them and get them out so that everybody, and the difficulty with that is by bringing them there, but by accepting these as the terms of engagement, we might say, by doing that, it ended up reducing the Christian faith and Christian life to a method. Do this to get saved. Do this, and if you do this in a revival, these things will happen, and these people will embrace faith in Jesus Christ, and they'll do it by doing this, 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 and this. It took it out of the history and pulled it into a methodology. And it's dangerous, and it still impacts our world today. It impacts it in a major way still today. This idea of trying to make it a methodology that then is trying to get everybody to experience this. And so you have thousands of people who have had some sort of a quote-unquote conversion experience, and I've noticed the quote-unquote, who've never authentically embraced Jesus Christ, and the Spirit is absent from their hearts and lives because of that. Now, the other side of it you had is what, and I try to come up with some better term, but empiricism is the term that, kind of the term for it, and I'm sorry I'm using that type of a word. I hate using those type of words. But empiricism basically tried to take the bottom floor and take it up to the top floor. So revivalism tried to take the top floor down to the bottom, and empiricism tried to take the bottom floor up to the top. That is to say, if your Christian faith, if your faith, whatever faith it may be, doesn't or isn't something that is scientifically testable, then discard it, toss it. Now, what's notoriously missing in this is history in this. It doesn't fit well into either of these categories. I don't want to dig too deep into that, but I do want to say it just to make this point, is that if the center point is Jesus Christ revealed in history, then this dichotomy can't work for us at all. What we have to recognize is that there is no split reality of this sort. That this is something that is part of our world that we have to say, this doesn't work in reality. It's not the way life works. Not only that, but our faith doesn't work this way. My faith is not something that I can relegate to the top floor of subjective feelings. Our faith is something that permeates all of life. And that the reason there is the possibility of that bottom floor, of there being an orderliness in the world that we can see and observe, is because it is created by a God who created it that way. And that God has entered into our world through Jesus Christ. And He's entered into the world through Jesus Christ and taken the brokenness of the world upon Himself. Now, I want us to see that, and I know that that's kind of jumping into really deep waters right there, but I think it's essential to help us understand some of the resistance to the Christian faith in the world in which we live. It's really helpful for us to think about that, because we have, as a result of this, a ton of different Jesuses running around. Now, I know that we really don't, but we do, in the sense that people, what they refer to or think of as Jesus, may not be what you mean when you're speaking of Jesus. When you speak of God or faith, what you mean by that may be not what they mean. And the reason for that is because they've defined those according to their personal feelings on that top floor. And this is just religious faith, and I can define that however I feel like. Why? Because religious faith is subjective, private, personal values, not objective, and not rooted in any objective reality. Do you see the problem there? I want you to make sure you understand that that's what happens in this. And so we have this guy in England, for example, who he says, I was in my room, and this literally happened. I'm not making this up at all. You can look this up on the internet. And he was frying bacon in a frying pan in his house, and he went to sleep, and he smelled smoke. And so he went and grabbed this burning pan, ran outside, dumped it, and turned around and looked into it, and there was an image of Jesus looking right back at him. And he said, Jesus showed up in my frying pan, and I'm going to hang it on my wall to remind me that Jesus looks over me. Now, the Jesus he is talking about is not the Jesus in your New Testament, who does not show up in bacon grease. But that's his perception. Why? I had an experience. So this is my experience. And if you have a different experience of Jesus, that's perfectly okay. You see it a few years ago in the Da Vinci Code, who presented this totally different vision of Jesus, and yet how this doesn't really contradict Christian faith, because it's just a different alternative view of Jesus we're talking about. Why can people do this? The reason they can is because they've moved religion to this subjective top floor. And so if it's religious, I can mold it. It's Play-Doh. I can mold it however I want to, because it's about what fits my needs, not about any objective reality. That's the world in which you face people that are resistant to the gospel. And it's one of the reasons it's difficult to testify clearly to the gospel in the world in which we live. So I want to ask ourselves, how can we determine what actually happened in the past? I want us to take a look at that. How do we determine what happened in the past? How do we do this? How can we? We've said that we want to make sure that we recognize that this is not about a subjective experience, but there was an objective reality in which Jesus Christ entered into history as a particular person at a particular time, and you cannot simply mold him according to your whims. That's what I want us to see. But how do you figure out what really happened in the past? I'll ask you this question. I actually want you to respond on this. Let's suppose that it came up that people were questioning what you actually ate yesterday. All right, so let's just go to lunch so we can zero it in on that one. How, if a question came up as to what you ate yesterday at lunch, how would you be able to have that discussion and prove what you really did or did not eat for lunch? Tell me, what are some ways? What would you do? I'm sorry? A receipt from the restaurant. So you'd have a document that was produced at that time, wouldn't you? All right? So you have a document. Now, the truth is, you could have picked somebody else's receipt up, and you could just be totally making this up, and you could be telling your spouse, no, I did not eat 3 pieces of cheesecake because I have this receipt, but it was really somebody else's receipt. So it's not foolproof, but you can get a document from that. What are some other ways? Witnesses, exactly. I had so-and-so was here with me, and they saw that I did not eat any dessert at all. They saw this. I really didn't, and they saw it, and they'll give you a testimony to this. Now, might these witnesses be lying? Okay, they might be lying, but there would be something you could appeal to. What else might you appeal to demonstrate what you did or did not eat for lunch yesterday? Physical evidence. There is in my car a bag with all the stuff wadded up in it from the wrappers, and it's under the seat, and you can look in that. Now, could that be from 3 days ago instead of 1 day ago? Maybe. Could it be that you planted that there knowing that your spouse is going to wonder if you really ate 3 pieces of cheesecake? Maybe. But it's a piece of evidence. Anything else you'd come up with? What if you had multiple witnesses that hadn't talked to each other and they're giving a similar story? Would be another way that you would do this. Now, I go through that because simply what I want you to see is 2 things. One of them is that history doesn't work the same way as science. Because in science, you replicate something and prove it by that, but history by its very nature is past. That's why it's called the past, is because it has already passed. And you can't do it again. You can't repeat it again and again. It was in the past. And no one piece of evidence absolutely proves everything. But taken together, a lot of evidences end up helping us to see that something is highly probable in this. Now, I belabor that because we have a world that expects if something's true for everybody, it's scientifically verifiable. Remember that bottom floor of the house? Okay? But that's not really true, and you don't live that way. It's really tough for you to absolutely scientifically verify your wedding anniversary. But you forget it. You forget that. And you're going to find you don't believe in scientific verifiability, because if you say to your spouse, dear, I couldn't verify it scientifically that was the day we got married. I couldn't verify that scientifically. I tried, but there was not enough evidence for me to verify it scientifically. How's that going to work for you? Nobody lives this way. Nobody lives really completely reliant on scientific evidence only. Nobody does. We don't live that way. We live by a combination of memories, of evidences, of all of those things, and whether we admit it or not, we take those as being objectively true. Your birthday, your anniversary, what you ate for lunch yesterday, all those. You take it on the preponderance of the evidence that you can pull up. And so let's take a look at, how do I determine what happened in the past? One of those ways is multiple witnesses. Multiple witnesses. That raises the likelihood that something really happened if you can come up with multiple witnesses. That is, more than one person who is telling basically the same story. But here's what makes it even more believable is the second one: independent witnesses. Because if you get multiple witnesses in a courtroom, let's say you've got 3 people, and they all tell the same story, word for word, identical, you're going to be a little bit skeptical of that, and rightly so. Because it's going to be pretty clear that they got together and they told the same story in the same words because they'd gotten together. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means they were corresponding with one another at some level. But independent witnesses, people who have the same basic story but say it in different words, that's good evidence at that point. Now, we're going to unpack it this afternoon a lot more clarity on this, but in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, there are 4 completely independent, they're not the 4 Gospels actually, we'll talk about that then, but there are 4 completely independent testimonies that did not correspond in any way that is discernible that tell about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And part of the independent witnesses is that those witnesses, if they agree on little details that you wouldn't have unless it really happened. We'll talk about that this afternoon. A third one is witnesses with nothing to gain by fabricating their testimony. They got no skin in the game. Or their testimony is actually going to be negative in terms of the outcome rather than positive. Let's think about Simon Peter, for example. Simon Peter is one of the apostles. Some of them, the stories of whether they really did experience the martyrdoms that are described in later traditions, some of them are really questionable, whether they really experienced those. But Simon Peter, there's good evidence that was written within a generation or less after the time when he was martyred that tells us about his martyrdom. So we can go to that one. What did Simon Peter have to gain by leaving his fishing business and traveling around the world proclaiming Jesus? What did he gain from that? In other words, what motivation would he have had? And if he's lying, he's going to know that he is lying. He's one of them that if he was lying, he knew it, that he was lying. What does he have to gain from fabrication? He gains nothing, and he loses everything, literally. He gains nothing and loses everything. He has nothing to gain by fabricating. And yet when you read Mark's gospel, you are reading the very words of Simon Peter, giving his testimony. He has nothing to gain from this. So again, use the courtroom analogy. You're in a courtroom, and you think, by this guy telling that truth, he actually loses. That's going to give some credence to what he says. Foolproof? No. But it sure raises the probability that what he's saying is true. And the last one of these is testimony recorded while the witnesses are still alive. Somebody mentioned over here a receipt. In other words, it's something that comes from that day or that era. We'll transfer that into the New Testament era. And do we have documents that were written while the witnesses were still alive? In other words, do we have documents that begin to circulate, and there are people alive who actually witnessed these events such that they could say, if something is false in that, they can write something to somebody and begin to circulate the word, this is not telling the truth, because the testimony, the witnesses are still alive. Now, in the case of the New Testament, every New Testament document was written while witnesses were still alive. It'd be a lot more sketchy and skeptical about the New Testament if these testimonies had come from, say, 110, 150 AD, in that range right there. But they don't. Every single one of them, at the very latest, comes from the mid-90s, so 60 years after the time of Jesus, at the latest. And several of them, most of them, come from far earlier than that. So multiple witnesses, independent witnesses, witnesses with nothing to gain if they were to fabricate testimony, and testimony that was recorded while witnesses were still alive. Now I want to spend a little bit of time, we're going to move right now, and we kind of already moved a little bit towards focusing on the Gospels. And just to give you a big picture idea of where we've gone and where we're headed, is I started out with a big picture of apologetics, and I narrowed it down to that we are going to focus on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, because I think that's the starting point for us. And the rest of the day, we're going to unfold deeper and deeper into the authenticity and the reliability of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus as recorded primarily in the Gospels. That's where we're going to go. So that's where we're at and where we're moving throughout the rest of the day. I want to deal with two specific questions that I want to they need to be talked about, because these are probably two of the questions that from atheists, at least, I get more often than any other. So I want to focus on these two as a foundation for some things we're going to do later on. One of them is, number one, if Jesus really did all these things, if he really performed all the miracles and he really rose from the dead, why isn't he mentioned in historical documents outside the New Testament? Why not? I mean, goodness. Shouldn't it be that if he did all these things, shouldn't Roman history mention him? Shouldn't other people mention him? Shouldn't he be mentioned just all over the place in the first century? If, indeed, it really happened. Here's a writer who writes this, and here's what he raises. He said, the Romans kept detailed legal records, but no record of the trial or crucifixion of Jesus has ever been found. From all the Roman authors, there are 3 small passages in Pliny, Suetonius, and Tacitus, but these authors were writing in the 2nd century, long after the supposed life of Jesus, and all they tell us is that Christians existed in the Roman world at this time, and nobody's doubted that anyway. That's this person's charge against the authenticity of the accounts found of Jesus. Now, there's a handful of things I want you to get about this, just that are really important things. Number one, the year 70 A.D. What happens in the year 70 A.D.? Anybody know what happens really significant in the year 70 A.D.? Jerusalem, destroyed, exactly. And according to very clear records from Josephus as well as others, all the Roman documents in Jerusalem were burned at that time. Everything. In the fortress where it was, all of it completely destroyed. So in the first place, this is an argument from silence. You don't know what may have been there. So the first response to this person, they said, the Romans kept detailed legal records. Yeah, they did, but they're all gone. They've all burned. And we have clear evidence from people who were not even Christians to let us know that these records were lost. They were burned in Jerusalem. So in the first place, you don't know what there was or wasn't. You have no clue, nor do I, what there may have been. There could have been, for all I know, now I'm not going to make an argument on this, but I'm just using this as an example, there could have been a detailed trial transcript of Pilate and Jesus. There could have been in that. There could have been a record of the people being paid off at some level to keep quiet. There could have been a record of concerns about his resurrection, but we don't know because all those records are gone. So it's important for us to recognize that in the first place. So what about the Roman histories? Why don't Roman histories mention Jesus in them? Well, in the first place, there's only one Roman history that was written in the middle point of the first century. It's written by a general. His name's Velleius Paterculus. And Velleius Paterculus writes this history sometime in the 40s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And so, no, he never mentions Jesus. But he was a retired army general who'd never visited, he was years before any information about Jesus would have reached the city of Rome. There's only one history of Rome written in the middle point of the second century, or the first century anyway, at that point. So there's no way that something could have been written at that time because no surviving history was written at that time. But what's more important than that is how insignificant Jesus would have seemed to the Roman historians. How insignificant he would have seemed. Remember, Jewish people are not popular with the Romans. There is a reason why their entire city gets destroyed and their temple gets burned. And it isn't just to do with one set of events. There was a lot of stuff leading up to that. And there was tension, and it was primarily because the Jews had the audacity to worship one and only one God and not to worship the gods of the Romans. They refused to worship the gods of the Romans. So they were very unpopular. They, at some level, were accepted still, or at least they got away with it. They were grudgingly accepted because at least they had an ancient temple and an ancient religion that reached far back. Now that you can also see why Christians are so persecuted, because they also have the audacity to claim one God, but they have no temple and from the perspective of the Romans, no history that reaches far back. But the Jews are not popular at this point. I tell you who'd be less popular, a Jewish radical, troublemaker, rabbi, walking around the country. People claim that he does miracles. That type of person is going to be written off as a crackpot by the Romans. He would have seemed very, very insignificant to the Romans. And in fact, such persons rarely made it into Roman texts except under one condition. They started a revolt. But Jesus specifically forbade his followers to start a revolt. And so he is even going to seem less significant to the Romans. Now, when would a Roman text have mentioned Jesus? Well, here's when it would have. Only when so many people identified themselves with Jesus that their loyalty to Jesus became a problem for the Roman Empire. That's when. And you know what? That's precisely what we find. Early 2nd century, by the time that Christians have grown enough, Christianity has grown enough, that the fact that they are refusing to worship the Roman gods and that the fact that they are being blamed for a fire in Rome, all these different things kind of rise to the forefront. And that's when Roman historians start mentioning them. They're an unpopular group. We know that by the mid-60s. They're extremely unpopular because who does Nero choose to charge with the fire in Rome? It's the Christians he chooses to blame the fire in Rome on. And so we know they're very unpopular by this point. And so by the early 2nd century, this unpopularity has grown to the point that you've got two popular histories of the Roman Empire during that era, early 2nd century, both of which mention Christians. Both of which mention Christians. One of them is from Suetonius. He speaks of that there were disturbances due to a certain Chrestus, and Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because of this. Tacitus speaks of Nero fastening the blame for the fire in Rome on the Christians. And interestingly, he says this, Christus, from whom they derived their name, suffered the extreme penalty. That's a euphemism for the cross, because cross and crucify were bad words that you didn't speak in polite company. Suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our governors, Pontius Pilate, and goes on and speaks of that. So we've got two Roman historians that both mention Christians by the time they grow to that point. Their movement grows to that point. Not only that, we have Christians, or at least Jesus mentioned in a man named Josephus. Unfortunately, this reference has been embellished over the years, but at some level, he still mentioned the existence of Jesus. And so the fact is that Jesus is mentioned at precisely the times and places that he would likely be, given the value that the Romans would place on a Jewish radical traveling around the country. But one of the things I like to do, if somebody raises this question, this is something that's great to help them understand this, is that raising the issue of Alexander the Great. And you think about, what on earth does Alexander the Great have to do with Jesus? We can ask them, do you believe Alexander the Great really went all the way east, conquered all these countries, everything like that? And people say, yeah, of course he did. He did this in the 4th century BC. Now, do you know that not one eyewitness account of Alexander's campaigns exists? Not one has survived. There are 5 written, but none of them survived, not any of them. None of them survive. 5 accounts do survive, but do you know when those 5 accounts were written? The earliest one is 600 years after the time of Alexander the Great. 600 years after Alexander the Great. Even inscriptions about Alexander the Great from his lifetime are rare. There's 5 of them. There are 5 inscriptions from Alexander the Great's own lifetime. This guy ruled the world. And there's not one eyewitness account. There's not one receipt with the date on it, so to speak, from his lifetime. Not one. And only 5 inscriptions survive. Now, if we were to try to apply to Alexander the Great what some people apply to Jesus, we'd be saying Alexander the Great either didn't exist or he wasn't who they said he was. That's what we'd have to say. Because let's look at Jesus. Jesus didn't rule the world. He's an obscure Jewish teacher that never traveled outside Judea, Samaria, Decapolis, and Galilee. And yet, within 40 years of his death or less, there are 3 complete biographies in circulation that survive to this day. So during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, there's 3 complete biographies, and another one emerges shortly afterwards. Within 70 years of his death or less, another biography emerges, the Gospel according to John, linked to an eyewitness. Not only that, you've got all of these texts of these. Did you know that in the 2nd century and 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, there are 5,000 fragments or complete copies of writings about Jesus by that time? Alexander the Great, 5. In that 5, and those 5 don't emerge till over 600 years afterwards. In the case of Jesus, in that same time period, actually a little bit less, you have 5,000 fragments, or more than 5,000 fragments or entire documents that talk about Jesus. Now, somebody wants to talk about lack of historical evidence. Let's look at Alexander the Great. Give me Alexander. You want to apply that standard to Alexander? He didn't exist. We don't know who went through and conquered or at least if he did exist, he wasn't who they said he was. 600 years before we get a biography that survived. 5 copies that are these ancient copies that have survived. Jesus, less than a generation. 3 biographies, a little bit longer, 4 biographies, over 5,000 documents within the first few centuries. So if somebody is saying there's not enough evidence about Jesus, what they're doing actually, and they're actually trying to judge Jesus by the standards that we would use for history today. Because as soon as you say something, it's on the internet, it's in newspaper, all those things like that, it goes immediately. But that's not the expectation. They're bringing an expectation to the life of Jesus that they would never apply to any other ancient individual at that point. So why don't historical documents mention Jesus outside the New Testament? Well, in the first place, they do by the time that it would be normal for that to happen. And if we want to compare him to others, there's far more testimony to Jesus than to thousands of other individuals, including somebody as prominent as Alexander the Great. One more thing I want to talk about real briefly is pagan parallels. As in this, I hear this all the time of, well, there were all sorts of religions that had dying and rising gods, and Jesus was just one more of those. Now, the first response to that is, show me the parallel. Because most people have read somebody that said something, and they've never gone back and seen if the original source really says this. Example, somebody came up with that a guy named Mithras, or not a guy, but a mystery cult religion, kind of the center point, the god of that he had 12 disciples. And okay, what's the evidence for that? Well, there's a picture painted of him that actually comes after the time of Christianity, by the way, not before. And in this picture, it's got his picture, and there's 12 others drawn around him. Now, in this document, it doesn't tell that these are disciples. They're most likely zodiac symbols, not actually disciples, or something of that sort but it doesn't say that. But this person says, well, that's where they borrowed it. Jesus, the disciples, the idea of 12 disciples, they borrowed it from Mithras, because of this picture that actually comes after the time of Jesus, and it doesn't even say they're disciples to begin with. So go back to the source. Always, if somebody says that, go back. You'll find them saying that this god or goddess was crucified on a cross. But you go back to it and you find out, okay, they were nailed to a tree, or they were hung from a tree, or they were nailed to a stake in the ground, or something like that, or they became hung on a tree and strangled. All these different things, but not the parallel that they're actually claiming for this. So let's just be aware of that. And you find that said often throughout so many different people claiming this. And I'm going to use Mithras just as an example, because Mithras is one that around Christmas time, inevitably somebody comes up with that it's borrowed from Mithras, okay? Let me tell you the actual story of Mithras, okay? The birth of Mithras, he was birthed, the claim that's made often is that Mithras was born in a cave with shepherds in attendance. Born in a cave with shepherds in attendance, and that he was virgin born. And the claim is that, you know what, all the stories about Jesus, they just borrowed from Mithras. Because Mithras, born in a cave with shepherds there, and he was virgin born. But you go back to the source of Mithras' life, and here's what you find out. He was birthed from solid stone, which I guess is sort of a virgin birth, kind of. I don't know how rocks lose their virginity. I don't know. But anyway, I'm just saying I guess it's only sort of. But he's birthed out of solid stone, okay? So he gets stuck on the way out, and a bunch of people in the field, who may or may not have been shepherds, they were just in the field, come and help pull him out of the stone. That's the claim. Now, once you actually look back at that, that's not really nearly so close to the New Testament as it's being claimed, is it? That's not even close to it. And that's what you find over and over and over in these is it's not nearly as close as what people are claiming. So if somebody brings that up, locate the primary source. Go back and find out what was really claimed about this God. Because every time I've done that, I have found that, this isn't really a parallel at all. And then determine as best as you can, does this parallel come before or after the New Testament? Because many of these come after the New Testament, and so it wasn't that the New Testament was stealing from them and making up the story, it was that they were stealing from the New Testament in many, many cases. Not all, but many of them. And then finally, is this parallel about the New Testament or later Christian traditions? That is to say, for example, there's one claim that I've seen go around, which is that the paintings of Mary and Jesus they are very, very similar to paintings made of a god and of a goddess and her child in Egypt. Therefore, the story was borrowed from the Egyptians. That's a claim that I've seen made. The difficulty is these paintings of Jesus with Mary don't come for hundreds of years later after the New Testament. So it doesn't have any effect on the truth of the New Testament. The same thing with Christmas celebrations. Often it says, you know what, there were pagans that used trees, and they had all these and all those things like that, and that therefore the Christians borrowed this from the pagans. Yeah, but the New Testament doesn't have anything about a Christmas tree in it. The New Testament doesn't have anything about all these later traditions. So it doesn't have to do with, it doesn't in any way detract from the authenticity and the authority of the New Testament, that there's these traditions that connect in some way. I want to pull it together and wrap it up with this for this segment. That the history really, really matters. I know I've dug a lot into history stuff, and if you're not into history, it may have been difficult to do that. I don't know. But it's really important because the whole point of the incarnation and the resurrection is that God did not act from a distance, but God entered into history. He actually intersected and entered into history, and he revealed himself in the context of human history. So these historical things, that's really matters for us being able to articulate and to defend our faith. Because in some sense, God hallowed history by he himself entering into it. And this is something that's amazing from a Christian perspective. Find another God who takes on flesh. In pagan traditions and other traditions, find me another God who takes on human flesh and enters into the muck and the mud of human history. You don't find it. Oh, you find tales of gods who temporarily metamorphose into some human form and then go back or something like that. But not a God who takes on human flesh, enters into human history through the birth canal of a Jewish peasant girl, and takes the suffering and the pain of humanity upon himself. That is unheard of. It is untold in anything else. It is something amazing and different that is beyond something I believe that any human being would fabricate. A few months ago at Easter, I was invited on Easter weekend to speak to the Society of Secular Students at the University of Louisville, which is, the title might suggest, it's not a lot of people that are celebrating Easter there, okay? The Society for Secular Students. And so I had a great dialogue with them. It was very enjoyable, in which basically just presenting the historical case for the Gospels and just spent time just in front of an entire room full of just hardcore atheists and presenting, here's from a historical perspective, and really tried to think through of how, if we applied the same standard to the New Testament as we applied other history, how does it fare? And trying to make the case that there is a historical case for this. And at the end, we had a question and answer that went on for actually hours afterward, and it was a great question and answer time. But one that stuck in my mind is a young man came forward, and he said, you know what, I actually like a lot of things about Christianity. He said, I like the life of Christianity. I think it's great. And I like what I hear about Christianity. But I'm an engineering student. And when I am doing calculations, it doesn't matter what happened 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Is there any way I can be a Christian and not have to take the history that it really happened? Is there any way I can? Because there's some way I can be a Christian and not have to accept the history because I want that. And everything in me wanted to say, well, yeah, there's a way. But the truth is, there isn't. There isn't. If I do not believe that Jesus Christ entered into human history, then all the rest falls apart. The life may appeal to you, but the reason that the life of the Christian exists is because Jesus entered into history and because of all that comes with that. The reason that the church has been an advocate when it's been at its best for justice and for people being treated in a just and equitable way is inseparable from the fact that God created humanity in his image and that Jesus Christ is the perfection of God's image. And that God allowed Jesus to take all the brokenness that we've brought to his image and to take that upon himself, and then triumphed over it in the empty tomb. And if that didn't happen, none of the rest works. And so I had to say to this young man, I hope, I pray, that you'll embrace Christ. But I can't tell you any other way to be a Christian than to believe that God has showed up in history. Because if he hasn't, none of the rest even works. It doesn't work without that. So that's what I say to you in this, is I want us, and we're going to dig into this afternoon, but as all of this really matters, because apart from God entering history, nothing works. Nothing works for our faith, for our life, if God did not enter into history, break the power of sin, and begin making the world new. It doesn't work without that.